The vast emptiness of space stretched endlessly in all directions as Commander Blake. Morrison carefully navigated his salvage vessel through the floating debris of what had once been a thriving human outpost. 300 years had passed since. The Great Silence, the mysterious day when every human voice in the galaxy suddenly went quiet, leaving behind only empty worlds and abandoned stations. Like ghosts scattered across the stars, Blake's weathered hands moved across the control panel. With practiced ease, his eyes scanning the readouts that displayed the familiar story of dead technology and worthless scrap. The Zellery Survey Corps had been picking through human ruins for decades now, searching for anything valuable enough to justify the fuel costs of these long expeditions into the Outer Rim territories. "Commander, we're approaching the coordinates." "For Kepler Station," announced his pilot, a young Zellery named Vex, who had joined the crew only 6 months ago. The pilot's enthusiasm for exploration had not yet been worn down by the endless succession of empty findings that characterized most salvage operations in former human space. Blake nodded without looking up from his displays. Kepler Station had been a mining operation before the Great Silence, one of hundreds of similar facilities that had extracted precious metals and rare elements from the asteroid fields of this sector. Like all human installations, it had been abandoned for centuries, slowly deteriorating in the cold vacuum of space while the galaxy moved on without its former inhabitants. The Galactic Consortium had officially declared humanity extinct 50 years ago, after decades of failed attempts to re-establish contact with Earth or any of the core human worlds. The jump gates that had once connected human space to the rest of the galaxy remained sealed. Their activation codes lost, along with the civilization that had created them. Most species had simply written off the humans as another failed experiment. In Galactic Expansion, a cautionary tale about the dangers of overreaching one's technological capabilities. "Sir, I'm getting some unusual readings on the scanner," Vex called out, his voice carrying a note of confusion that made Blake finally look up from his work. The pilot was frowning at his instruments, tapping the display as if he thought it might be malfunctioning. "What kind of readings?" Blake asked, moving to look over the younger officer's shoulder. The scanner display showed the familiar outline of Kepler Station, but something was different. Where there should have been the cold, dark signature of dead metal and empty corridors, the instruments were detecting active power sources and what appeared to be life support systems operating at full capacity. "The station appears to be fully operational," Vex said, his voice barely above a whisper. "But that's impossible. This place has been dead for 3 centuries. Blake felt a chill run down his spine as he stared at the readouts. In all his years of salvage work, he had never encountered a human facility that showed any signs of recent activity. The technology required to keep a space station operational for 300 years without maintenance was beyond anything the current galactic powers possessed. "Run a full spectrum analysis," Blake ordered, trying to keep his voice steady despite the growing unease in his chest. "I want to know everything about those power signatures." As their ship drew closer to the station, the impossible became undeniable. Kepler Station was not just functional, it was thriving. New modules had been added to the original structure, sleek and purposeful additions that incorporated design elements Blake had never seen before. The hull plating gleamed with a metallic finish that seemed to absorb and reflect light in ways that defied conventional physics. "Commander," the communications officer called out from her station, her voice tight with disbelief. "We're receiving a transmission from the station." Blake turned to stare at the communications panel, his mind struggling to process what he was hearing. No human had spoken to a galactic citizen in 3 centuries. The very idea that someone might be alive on that station seemed to violate everything they knew about the fate of humanity. "Put it through," he said, his voice barely audible over the hum of the ship's engines. The main screen flickered to life, displaying the image of a human male in what appeared to be a military uniform. The man's face was weathered but alert, his eyes holding an intelligence that spoke of long experience and careful observation. Behind him, Blake could see the interior of what looked like a Statithire command center, filled with displays and control panels that made their own ship's technology look primitive by comparison. "Zellery vessel, this is Captain James Parker, of the Terran Reconnaissance Division," the human said, speaking perfect Zellery, with only the slightest trace of an accent. "You are in restricted space. State your business here." Blake opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. The sight of a living human, speaking to him from a station that should have been dead for centuries, had temporarily short-circuited his ability to form coherent thoughts. "We are a salvage crew from the Zellery Survey Corps," he finally managed. To say we were not aware that this station was occupied. Captain Parker's expression remained neutral, but Blake thought he detected a slight smile playing at the corners of the man's mouth. "I'm sure you weren't," the human replied. "Nevertheless, you will follow our escort to the station. Any deviation from course will be considered a hostile act." Before Blake could ask what escort he was referring to, his pilot let out a sharp exclamation of surprise. "Sir, we have contacts emerging from the asteroid field." Blake spun around to look at the tactical display and felt his blood turn to ice. Ships were materializing from the shadows of the asteroids, sleek and angular vessels that moved with a predatory grace that spoke of advanced propulsion systems and sophisticated maneuvering capabilities. Their hulls bore symbols that sent a shock of recognition through his consciousness: the eagle and stars of the Terran Federation, a government that had supposedly ceased to exist 3 centuries ago. "How many?" Blake asked, his voice barely a whisper. 12 ships, sir," the pilot replied, his hands trembling slightly as he worked the controls. "All of them are showing power signatures that are off the charts. I've never seen anything like this technology." Blake stared at the tactical display, watching as the human ships took up formation around his vessel with military precision. Ship was roughly the same size as his salvage vessel, but they moved with a fluid grace that suggested capabilities far beyond anything in the current galactic arsenal. "Acknowledged, Captain Parker," Blake said into the communications channel, his voice barely audible over the pounding of his own heart. "We will comply with your instructions." As the human ships guided them toward the station, Blake realized that everything they thought they knew about the galaxy was about to change. Humanity was not extinct. They were here, alive, and apparently thriving, with technology that made the rest of the galaxy look like primitive savages playing with sticks and stones. The question that burned in his mind was simple, but terrifying. What else had they been wrong about? The moment Blake's salvage vessel crossed the threshold into Kepler Station's docking bay, he knew he was witnessing something that challenged everything he understood about technology and physics. The massive chamber stretched out before them, like a cathedral of metal and light, its walls lined with docking ports that could accommodate ships of every size and configuration. But what truly amazed him were the gravity fields that seemed to possess their own intelligence, reaching out to embrace his vessel with invisible hands that guided it toward an empty berth with mathematical precision. Vex, his young pilot gripped the controls with white knuckles as the ship moved through the docking sequence entirely on its own. "Sir, I'm not controlling this anymore," he said, his voice tight with barely controlled fear. "The station is flying our ship for us." Blake watched in fascination as streams of energy danced across the viewport, creating patterns that seemed to shift and flow like liquid light. The air itself appeared to be alive with power, shimmering with forces that his instruments couldn't identify or measure. This wasn't just advanced technology, it was something that operated on principles his species had never encountered. The docking clamps engaged with a gentle vibration that ran through the hull, and Blake realized they were now completely at the mercy of their human hosts. The thought should have terrified him, but instead he felt a strange sense of anticipation. After 3 centuries of silence, humanity was finally ready to speak. Captain James Parker was waiting for them in the arrival chamber, and Blake's first impression was how completely ordinary the man appeared. Parker stood about 6 feet tall, with brown hair that was beginning to show touches of gray at the temples, wearing a uniform that looked practical rather than ceremonial. His face carried the kind of lines that came from years of making difficult decisions, and his eyes held a depth that spoke of secrets carefully guarded. What struck Blake most was how the 2 soldiers flanking Parker seemed to blur the line between man and machine. Their equipment didn't appear to be worn so much as integrated, flowing seamlessly from their bodies in ways that suggested a level of cybernetic enhancement that current galactic technology couldn't achieve. They moved with perfect coordination, their eyes constantly scanning the area with an alertness that never seemed to falter. "Commander Morrison," Parker said, stepping forward and extending his hand in the ancient human gesture of greeting. His voice carried a warmth that seemed genuine, though Blake detected an underlying strength that suggested this man was accustomed to being obeyed without question. Blake hesitated for a moment, staring at the offered hand as if it might be a trap. The simple act of shaking hands with a human felt monumentally significant, like crossing a bridge that had been burned 3 centuries ago. "We thought humanity was extinct," Blake said as he finally took Parker's hand, surprised by the firm grip and the calluses that spoke of physical work, despite the advanced technology surrounding them. Parker's smile was slight but unmistakable. "That was exactly what we wanted you to think," he replied. 300 years ago, when the major galactic powers began looking at our territories with increasing hunger, Earth's government faced an impossible choice. We could fight a war we couldn't win, or we could disappear completely, he gestured. For Blake and his crew to follow him deeper into the station, leading them through corridors that seemed to pulse with their own inner light. The walls themselves appeared to be alive, their surfaces rippling with patterns that reminded Blake of neural networks or the flow of blood through veins. "We chose to vanish," Parker continued as they walked. "Every human colony, every outpost, every ship, we pulled them all back behind a technological barrier that made us invisible to your sensors. While the galaxy carved up our empty worlds and convinced itself that we were gone forever, we were actually just getting started." Blake's mind raced as he tried to process the implications of what he was hearing. But the resources required for such an operation, the coordination. It would take the combined effort of every species in the consortium to achieve something like that. "You're thinking like someone who still believes in the limitations of conventional technology," Parker said, his tone patient, but with an edge that suggested he was accustomed to having his capabilities underestimated. 3 centuries of focused development can accomplish remarkable things when you're not distracted by politics, trade disputes, or territorial expansion. They entered a vast observation chamber that took Blake's breath away. The room was dominated by a series of holographic displays that showed real-time feeds from across the galaxy. He recognized consortium territories, major trade routes, military installations, and even the private communications of high-ranking officials. The level of surveillance was staggering in its scope and detail. "You've been watching us all along," Blake said, his voice barely above a whisper as he stared at the displays showing the most classified locations in consortium space. "Watching, learning, recording," Parker confirmed. "We've monitored every war, every treaty, every diplomatic negotiation. We've seen the rise and fall of governments, the birth and death of civilizations. While you fought your petty conflicts and expanded your territories, we've been preparing for the day when we would need to act." Blake turned to face the human captain directly. "But why reveal yourselves now? Why break 3 centuries of perfect secrecy?" Parker's expression darkened, and for the first time Blake saw something dangerous flash in the man's eyes, because the Corvani Empire has begun systematically exterminating species they consider inferior. It started with the Trilaxians too. Years ago, claiming it was necessary for galactic security. Now, they're preparing to do the same to the ethereal collective. The holographic displays shifted to show Corvani fleet movements, their ships massing at the edge of ethereal space like predators preparing to strike. Blake had heard rumors of the Trilaxian situation, but the official reports had painted it as a necessary police action rather than genocide. "We've been waiting for a moment when our intervention would be both necessary and justified," Parker continued. "The Corvani have provided us with that moment. They believe they can commit genocide without consequence because they think they're the strongest military power in the galaxy." Blake stared at the tactical displays, each one showing a level of intelligence gathering that suggested humans had been among the galactic community all along, invisible and patient as spiders in their web. "How many of you are there?" Blake asked, his voice filled with awe and growing fear. Parker's smile was cold as the space between stars. "Enough to make the Corvani Empire regret their decision to test our resolve, Commander. More than enough to remind the galaxy that humanity didn't disappear, we simply chose to wait for the right moment to return." The first sign that something extraordinary was happening came at exactly 1427 Galactic Standard Time, when every communication device in consortium space suddenly displayed the same message, from the most basic civilian communication tablets to the heavily encrypted military networks that connected the most secure installations across the galaxy. The words appeared with crystalline clarity that brooked no argument or denial. Humanity lives. We remember. Return. Admiral Robert Hayes stood on the bridge of his flagship, the massive Corvani Dreadnought Dominator, watching the impossible message flicker across his command screens. His scaled skin, a deep green that marked him as a member of the Corvani warrior caste, rippled with barely controlled fury as he processed what he was seeing. Computer malfunction, he declared to his bridge crew, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had spent 40 years climbing the ranks of the Corvani military. Some amateur hacker group trying to create panic with outdated human mythology. Even as he spoke, his confidence began to crack. The message hadn't just appeared on their screens, it had bypassed every security protocol, every encryption algorithm, every firewall that protected the Corvani fleet's communication systems. The technology required to achieve such a feat was beyond anything the current galactic powers possessed. Lieutenant Commander Vask, his communication officer, looked up from his console with an expression of growing alarm. "Sir, we're receiving similar reports from every ship in the fleet. This message has appeared on every communication network in consortium space simultaneously." Hayes felt a chill run down his spine as the implications began to sink in. The Corvane Empire controlled the most advanced military technology in the galaxy, with security systems that had been tested against every known form of cyber attack. For someone to penetrate their network so completely suggested capabilities that shouldn't exist. "Contact High Command," Hayes ordered. "I want a full analysis of this security breach within the hour." But before his communication officer could carry out the order, alarms began sounding throughout the bridge. The main tactical display lit up with incoming priority transmissions from across the sector, Cute One carrying reports that seemed to defy logical explanation. The first report came from the Kepler system, where a Zellery salvage crew had encountered an active human installation. The second came from the Vega sector, where ancient Terran defense platforms had suddenly powered up after 3 centuries of dormancy. The third came from the core worlds themselves, where long-range sensors had detected human ships moving through supposedly empty space. "This is impossible," Hayes muttered, staring at the tactical display as more reports flooded in. "Humans have been extinct for 300 years. These must be elaborate hoaxes." But his certainty wavered as he read the detailed sensor readings and authentication codes that accompanied each report. The technology signatures were unmistakably human, but they incorporated advances that made current galactic science look primitive by comparison. "Sir," his intelligence officer called out, his voice tight with barely controlled panic. "We're receiving reports that someone has been accessing classified consortium databases for decades. The security breaches go back at least 50 years. Hayes turned to stare at the young officer, feeling the first stirrings of genuine fear. "What kind of information?" "Everything, sir. Military deployment schedules, diplomatic communications, trade agreements, even personal files on high-ranking officials. Someone has been watching us for a very long time." The bridge fell silent as the crew processed this information. The idea that their most closely guarded secrets had been compromised for decades was almost too terrifying to contemplate. "Sir," the communication officer announced, his voice cracking slightly. "Our own AI is reporting unauthorized access to the fleet network." Hayes spun toward the main display, watching in horror as his flagship's central computer began displaying a message that made his blood run cold. The words appeared in perfect Corvani script, written with the formal precision of military correspondence. "Admiral Hayes, this is Admiral Michael Torres of the Terran Deep Space Fleet. You have 72 hours to withdraw all Corvani forces from ethereal space. This is your only warning." The message was signed with authentication codes that Hayes recognized as belonging to the highest levels of human military command, codes that hadn't been used in 3 centuries but were somehow still valid. "Impossible," Hayes snarled, his scaled fists clenching as he stared at the display. Our networks are protected by quantum encryption algorithms. No one can penetrate them. But even as he spoke, more reports began arriving from across the galaxy. Government officials who had served in various positions for decades were simultaneously revealing themselves as human agents. The consortium's intelligence networks, their military communications, their trade agreements all had been compromised by a species they thought was extinct. Haze. Communication board lit up with an incoming transmission from the Zalari trade. Minister, a normally composed diplomat whose calm demeanor had made her one of the most respected figures in galactic politics. But when her image appeared on the screen, her face showed signs of strain that Hayes had never seen before. Admiral, she said, her voice shaking slightly, we've just discovered that my chief advisor has been human for 27 years. 27 years, Hayes. He's been sitting in our most sensitive meetings, reading our most classified documents. Reporting, everything back to Earth. Hayes felt his heart skip a beat. If the humans had infiltrated the Zalari government at the highest levels, how many other species had been compromised? How long had they been watching, learning, preparing? How many others? Hayes asked, though he dreaded the answer. We don't know, the trade minister replied. We're conducting emergency security reviews across all our departments. But preliminary reports suggest the infiltration is extensive. Admiral, how long have they been among us? Haas cut the communication and turned to his tactical officer, a seasoned veteran who had served with him for over a decade. Assemble the fleet, he ordered, his voice carrying the conviction of someone who had decided to fight rather than surrender. If these humans want to play games, we'll give them a war they'll never forget. But as he gave the order, a chilling thought occurred to him. If humanity had been watching for 3 centuries, if they had agents embedded throughout the galaxy, if they had technology that could penetrate the most secure networks without detection, then what else had they been preparing for? The answer to that question would determine not just the fate of the Corvani Empire, but the future of every species in the galaxy. The vast emptiness of space around the ethereal homeworld suddenly erupted with the arrival of the largest military force the galaxy had seen in decades. 300 Corvani warships dropped out of hyperspace in perfect formation, their hulls gleaming with the deadly promise of overwhelming firepower. Admiral Robert Hayes stood on the bridge of his flagship, the massive dreadnought Dominator, watching as his fleet spread across the star system like a net of destruction. The ethereal homeworld hung before them like a blue-green jewel, its surface covered with the crystalline cities that housed one of the galaxy's most peaceful civilizations. The ethereals were a species of pure energy beings who had chosen to live in physical form, creating beautiful works of art and contributing to galactic culture through their unique perspective on existence. They had no military forces, no weapons of war, no way to defend themselves against the coming assault. Admiral, his tactical officer reported, his voice carrying the satisfaction of a predator about to strike. All ships report ready for bombardment. We have enough firepower to reduce their entire civilization to dust within hours. Oz nodded grimly, his scaled hands gripping the command rail as he prepared to give the order that would demonstrate Corvani's supremacy to the entire galaxy. The humans had threatened him, had dared to challenge the might of the Corvani Empire with their mysterious warnings and ancient claims. Now he would show them what happened when anyone stood against the strongest military force in known space. Begin. Bombardment positions, he ordered, his voice carrying across the fleet communications to every ship in the Armada. We'll show these ghost humans what happens when they threaten the Corvani Empire. But as his ships moved into their attack formation, something impossible began to happen. The space around them seemed to shimmer and bend as if reality itself was being twisted by forces beyond comprehension. The stars in the distance wavered like reflections in disturbed water, and Hayes felt a chill run down his spine as he realized they were no longer alone. Human ships began materializing around them, merging from what appeared to be folds in space itself. These were not the crude vessels that had once comprised humanity's merchant fleet 3 centuries ago. These ships moved with fluid grace, their hulls seeming to exist in multiple dimensions simultaneously. Some appeared solid one moment and translucent the next, as if they were phasing in and out of normal space according to principles that defied every law of physics. Hayes understood. "Sir," his sensor officer called out, his voice tight with disbelief. "I'm reading over 400 contacts. They're surrounding us completely." Hayes stared at the tactical display, watching as more human ships continued to appear. The lead vessel was a massive dreadnought that made even his own flagship look small by comparison. Its hull was a deep black that seemed to absorb light, rather than reflect it, and across its bow were letters that burned with their own inner fire, indomitable. "This is Admiral Linda Martinez of the Terran Deep Space Fleet." It came a voice that carried the authority of 3 centuries of preparation and planning. The transmission was crystal clear despite the fact that Hayes could see no obvious communication arrays on the human ships. "You were warned, Admiral Hayes. You chose not to listen." Hayes felt his heart racing as he processed what he was seeing. The human fleet had appeared without any sensor warning, materializing from nothing as if they had been waiting in another dimension. Their technology was so far beyond anything the Corvani possessed that it might as well have been magic. "Possible," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the hum of his ship's engines. "These ships, they're not following the laws of physics." But there was no time for wonder or scientific curiosity. Hayes had built his entire career on the principle that overwhelming force could solve any problem. And he was not about to back down now, even in the face of impossible odds. "Open fire," he commanded, his voice cracking with desperation as he realized the magnitude of what they were facing. "All ships, engage the enemy. Show them what Corvani firepower can do." The response was immediate and devastating. 300 Corvani warships unleashed their full arsenal in a coordinated barrage that should have been capable of destroying an entire star system. Plasma cannons that could melt through asteroid-sized chunks of metal. Particle beams that could split atoms. Quantum torpedoes that could tear holes in space itself. All of it focused on the human fleet in a symphony of destruction that lit up the darkness between the stars, but the human ships seemed to dance between the incoming fire like performers in some cosmic ballet. Some of them phased out of normal space entirely, allowing the weapons to pass harmlessly through empty space where they had been moments before. Others absorbed the energy weapons directly, their hulls seeming to grow brighter and more solid. As they fed on the power being directed at them, the Indomitable itself remained perfectly motionless as the entire barrage washed over it. The destructive energy simply vanishing as if it had never existed. Hayes watched in horror as his most powerful weapons proved completely ineffective against technology that operated on principles he couldn't begin to understand. "Our turn," Admiral Martinez said quietly, her voice carrying across the communication channels with the calm certainty of someone who had been preparing for this moment for centuries. What followed was not a battle in any conventional sense. It was a demonstration of power so complete and overwhelming that it redefined Hayes' understanding of what was possible. Human weapons that seemed to bend space and time itself tore through Corvani hulls like they were made of paper. Ships that were completely destroyed by the overwhelming firepower were instantly rebuilt by clouds of microscopic machines that swarmed over the wreckage and reconstructed them from the molecular level up. The Indomitable disabled Hayes' flagship, using a weapon that created localized distortions in space-time, twisting the very fabric of reality around the Dominator until its engines and weapons systems simply stopped functioning. Within minutes, the mighty Corvani fleet was reduced to floating debris and emergency beacons, their crews trapped in crippled vessels that had been rendered completely helpless. "Admiral Hayes," Martinez's voice crackled through the damaged communication. "The system of his flagship will broadcast a message to your empire. Tell them that humanity has returned. Tell them that genocide is no longer an option in our galaxy." Hayes, trapped in his crippled ship and surrounded by the wreckage of his once mighty fleet, stared at the human vessels in shock and growing terror. "What are you?" he whispered. "We are what you forced us to become," Martinez replied, her voice carrying the weight of 3 centuries of preparation and patience. "We are the shepherds of a galaxy that thought it could do without us." The Great Hall of the Galactic Council had never seen such chaos. Representatives from every major species in the galaxy crowded into the chamber, their voices creating a cacophony of fear, anger, and desperate confusion. The holographic displays that dominated the center of the room showed the devastating aftermath of what was already being called the Battle of Ethereal Prime, where the mighty Corvani fleet had been reduced to floating wreckage in a matter of minutes. Admiral Linda Martinez walked into the chamber with the quiet confidence of someone who had spent 3 centuries preparing for this moment. She was a woman of average height, with graying hair and weathered features that spoke of long years spent in the depths of space. Her uniform was simple and practical, bearing none of the elaborate decorations that marked the military leaders of other species. Yet when she entered the room, every conversation stopped. Every eye turned toward her with a mixture of awe and terror. Behind her, the tactical displays shifted to show the true scope of humanity's return. These were not just the ships that had appeared at Ethereal Prime, but a vast network of hidden installations scattered across multiple dimensions of space. Cities that existed in the spaces between stars, manufacturing facilities that operated in parallel realities, and defensive platforms that could materialize anywhere in the galaxy within minutes. "Honored delegates," Martinez began, her voice carrying easily to every corner of the vast chamber, despite the fact that she spoke in a normal tone. "For 3 centuries, you have lived in a galaxy without humanity. You have carved up our territories, dismissed our legacy, and convinced yourselves that we were extinct." She gestured toward the displays, which now showed detailed maps of human space as it had existed before the Great Silence. But we were never gone. We were simply waiting, watching and preparing for the day when we would be needed again. The Zalari representative, a tall figure with blue-scaled skin who had served as Commander Morrison's superior, leaned forward in his seat. His voice shook slightly as he asked the question that was on everyone's mind. "How many of you are there? How is it possible that you could remain hidden for so long?" Martinez smiled, and there was something both sad and proud in her expression. "Earth's population now numbers in the hundreds of billions. We have established colonies in parallel dimensions, built cities in the spaces between stars, and created a civilization that transcends the physical limitations you still struggle with." The numbers were staggering for the Great Silence. Humanity had numbered only in the tens of billions across all their worlds. The idea that they had not only survived but multiplied to such an extent while remaining completely hidden defied every assumption the galaxy had made about their capabilities. Admiral Hayes, who had been brought to the council chamber under heavy guard, spoke through gritted teeth. His once proud uniform was torn and stained, and his scaled features bore the marks of a man who had seen his entire worldview shattered in a single day. "What do you want from us? What is the price of your mercy?" Martinez's expression hardened, and for a moment, the assembled delegates saw a glimpse of the steel that had enabled humanity to survive 3 centuries of isolation. "We want an end to genocide, an end to the strong preying on the weak simply because they can. We did not return to reclaim our old territories or to seek revenge for past wrongs. We returned to ensure that what happened to us never happens to any other species again." The chamber erupted in murmurs and heated discussions as the implications of her words sank in. The Corvani delegate, a military officer who had served under Hayes, stood up aggressively. "And if we refuse, what happens? 2 species that choose not to accept your protection?" Martinez's voice remained calm, but there was an underlying current of absolute certainty that made every being in the chamber understand that this was not a negotiation. "Then you will discover what 3 centuries of focused development can accomplish when a species has nothing to lose and everything to protect. We have become something beyond your current understanding. We can exist in multiple realities simultaneously, manipulate the fundamental forces of the universe, and if necessary, remove threats to galactic peace with surgical precision." The silence that followed was deafening. The assembled delegates began to understand that humanity had not simply returned with better weapons or more advanced ships. They had evolved into something entirely new. A post-human civilization that operated according to principles that the rest of the galaxy couldn't even comprehend. "The Terran Protectorate is now a reality," Martinez continued, her voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. We will guarantee the safety of any species that chooses peaceful coexistence.
Oh.
We will protect the weak from the strong. We will ensure that never again will a civilization face extinction simply because their neighbors grew hungry for their worlds or resources. She turned to address the entire assembly directly, her gaze sweeping across the faces of beings who represented hundreds of different worlds and cultures. The galaxy has changed, whether you choose to accept it or not. Humanity is no longer the species that once sought your approval or feared your aggression. We are your guardians now, and we will fulfill that role with or without your consent. As the delegates filed out of the chamber in stunned silence, many of them already composing messages to their home governments, Martinez received a communication from Captain Parker at Kepler Station. His voice carried across the vast distances of space as clearly as if he were standing beside her. "Admiral, the first generation of post-return children have been asking about the old stories," Parker reported. "They want to know what it was like when humanity was afraid, when we had to hide from the rest of the galaxy." Martinez smiled as she looked out through the chamber's transparent walls at the stars that stretched endlessly in all directions. These were the same stars that had once seemed lost forever. When humanity had been forced to make the terrible choice between extinction and isolation, tell them that fear was just another limitation we had to overcome, James. Tell them that we came back not as conquerors seeking revenge, but as protectors, ensuring that no species would ever again face what we faced. Tell them that the galaxy is finally safe for those who choose peace over war. On Earth, in the great cities that now spanned multiple dimensions and existed in the spaces between realities, human children looked up at stars that blazed with new promise. The age of hiding was over. The age of protection had begun. Humanity had returned to reclaim not just their place among the stars, but their destiny as the guardians of a galaxy that had learned to live without them, but would never again have to face the darkness alone.